This is Marcus Schrenker. In 2009, he tried faking his own death by crashing his airplane near a Florida neighborhood. As it turns out, Mark had a lot to run away from after being caught scamming his company's clients out of millions of dollars across several states. In the days following his capture, Mark was exposed in the media as a con artist who crossed every line to get what he wanted, even stealing from members of his own family in the end. Complicating this story is a biography written about Mark by his fellow inmate Matthew Cox, which Mark would later disavow was bogus because it didn't exonerate him the way he hoped it would. So what exactly did Mark do to land himself in so much trouble, and how did he manage to screw up his escape plan so badly? Marcus Schrenker was born November 27, 1970, and grew up in Merrillville, Indiana. By his own account, he had an unhappy childhood, characterizing his mother and stepfather as angry alcoholics who constantly fought. Mark told his biographer that his penchant for lying developed early in his adolescence. He recounted telling his friends that his house was being painted one time because he didn't want them to witness his parents arguing. Mark said that lying eventually became second nature to him, a crutch to escape the misery of his home life. He supposedly spent some time in a mental health facility as a teenager after beating his stepfather to a pulp over how he treated his mother. After that, he was sent to live with his estranged biological father. Despite being removed from the hostile environment at his mother's house, Mark continued developing a reputation as a troublemaker. He was known to tell fibs to skip class or to get out of not finishing schoolwork. Lying became a pattern in his relationships as well, typically to make himself more attractive to his peers or romantic interests, or to cover for his increasingly shady behavior. Mark was said to have caught gonorrhea and passed it on to his high school girlfriend on 2 separate occasions after cheating on her. Apparently he covered by saying the doctor told him the disease was the result of her uncleanliness, rather than his own promiscuity. By the time high school was done, Mark had developed a lifelong interest in aviation. He set his sights on Purdue University, where he'd pursue a bachelor's degree in aviation technology and finance. All signs pointed to Mark being positioned for a successful career in finance. Yet his worst tendencies almost became his undoing before he finished his first year of college. Mark was arrested in 1990 for selling stolen jewelry to a pawn shop 2 years prior. He tried explaining to police that he had no way of knowing the goods were ripped off, but the cops didn't buy his story. Mark was thus sentenced to a little over 2 weeks in jail. His lawyer successfully argued that Mark had committed the crime while he was a minor, and it was unconstitutional to charge him for it as an adult. Mark's record was thus expunged. Aside from getting an earful from his angry father, for now he had gotten off scot-free. By the time he was well into college, Mark had developed the same taste for alcohol as his mother. In 1991, Mark applied for his first credit card, apparently spending most of the $4,000 balance on booze. He filed for bankruptcy later that year. Mark tried pinning the blame for this on college frat boys who he said committed fraud by taking out the credit cards in his name. At some point, Mark joined his university cheerleading squad, a failed attempt at meeting women. It seems Mark quickly became known for taking these young ladies up in airplanes to have them join the Mile High Club. Aside from making up stories to impress the co-eds, Mark boasted to his peers about interning for NASA, a complete and total fabrication. This self-invented association with the agency lasted his whole life long, and over the years he had apparently began telling people about how he predicted the Space Shuttle Columbia disaster ahead of 2003. There's no indication he ever did. Mark met a girl named Michelle Daly during a visit to LaPorte, Indiana in 1993, and the two hit it off immediately. Their first date ended, of course, in an airplane. The couple married 2 years later. Now a fresh graduate from Purdue, Mark took on an entry-level job at John Hancock Life Insurance Company as a financial planner while the couple expected their first child. This, of course, didn't live up to the lofty ambitions Mark had for himself, but although the work was monotonous, it provided him the chance to practice his schmoozing. In time, Mark mastered the art of the cold call, no doubt helped by his willingness to bend the truth to potential customers. As his family grew, so did Mark's urge to make more money. He said one of his earliest schemes involved dressing himself up like a college student and driving to the Indianapolis International Airport. Here, Mark apparently lied to the secretary, saying he was a master's student researching pilot's fatigue, and asked if he could have the contact information for some of the pilots. After managing to convince her superior with a sob story about the difficulty of writing his thesis, Mark was apparently given his list. And to his amazement, it contained some 300,000 names and addresses of pilots across America. He knew this information certainly should not have been handed out so easily, but wasted no time getting to work on his pitch. Mark quickly made handsome commissions selling senior pilots on million-dollar life insurance policies. If he was questioned about how he got their contact information, he'd usually make something up and start talking about aviation. His impressive technical knowledge alone was often enough to lower a target's guard. These tactics helped Mark become one of the top financial planners in the entire United States at the time. This success gave him the idea to set up his own financial firm where he could expand beyond the paltry offerings at John Hancock. And so, not long after, Heritage Wealth Management opened its doors. Described as a, quote, boutique-style Wall Street firm in the middle of Indianapolis, Mark spared no expense cultivating an image of prestige to sell his clients on. Now it was time for Mark to enjoy that luxurious lifestyle himself, starting with an expensive 5-bedroom home in Geist, Indianapolis. Mark's growing success in the late 90s had him meeting with clients across multiple states in a day, giving him the perfect excuse to buy his own plane. And indeed, he dropped millions of dollars on cutting-edge aircraft over the next few years. He began flying in air shows, both to satisfy his daredevil streak and to drum up business through impressive stunts. After dozens of these shows, Mark seemed to have gotten the idea he was invincible. But a near-fatal crash in mid-2000 would prove otherwise. Though Mark survived, he was left with extensive injuries to his spine and almost constant pain. For this, he was prescribed OxyContin, and as he'd soon realize, he quite liked it. Throughout 2000 and early 2001, Heritage did business with a firm called Multi-Financial Securities Corporation. Mark's contract with Multi-Financial was quickly terminated because the, quote, representatives' mutual fund sales practices were inconsistent with firm policy. In short, Multi-Financial learned that Mark was performing an excessive number of mutual fund switches apparently on behalf of clients, without providing documentation to prove that these were authorized. Mark did this to collect commissions off each switch, an unethical practice known as churning. Before long, churning became the bread and butter of Mark's many scams to steal client money. But everything would unexpectedly change that fall. 9/11 shook American confidence in flight travel, which had a devastating effect on Heritage Wealth Management. Mark's staff was dropping like flies, and lawsuits from investors began piling up. The man was left with no choice. He filed for a second bankruptcy in 2003. Mark drowned his sorrows with a dangerous combination of alcohol and prescription painkillers, a coping mechanism that worked for the time being. There was one problem with the bankruptcy plan, however. Heritage had too much cash to be considered insolvent. Mark had no intention of losing everything, and as such began looking for ways to hide assets, even if it meant fraud. But the courts were already on to him, saying Mark tried cheating the IRS out of thousands of dollars by underreporting his income the previous year. The court's trustee accused Mark of making questionable transfers of assets ahead of the bankruptcy proceeding, citing tens of thousands he had spent on landscaping and buying audio equipment. Mark challenged this by saying the spending was done to the benefit of his business. One court document read, quote, "It is obvious to the court that the debtor has access to a significant cash flow that he is using for his personal benefit that has not been disclosed in this bankruptcy filing and in his personal tax returns." Mark contested this, shooting back with, quote, "The trustee is obviously motivated to make it appear we've done something fraudulent because they recover 33% of every dollar that they can squeeze out of these small companies." Years later, he claimed the bankruptcy was filed by a lawyer who forged his signature, though of course this doesn't explain why he let things drag out so long if this was in fact the case. The final outcome of the bankruptcy fiasco remains unclear, but evidently Mark was able to slither his way out of any lasting trouble for the time being. Mark was able to turn things around for Heritage after coming across National Western Life, a company selling equity index annuities. Though he believed they were pitching a, quote, shitty product, he saw a chance to make a pile of money through hefty commissions and couldn't resist going all in. Acting as a general agent, Mark began convincing his remaining clients to invest with National Western rather than more stable stocks like Johnson & Johnson. He promised hefty returning dividends that tapered off after the first year, although he left that second part out in his pitch. Even if this meant his clients eventually lost money, Mark's commissions would be significantly higher. Gone were his financial woes. One of Mark's longest and most loyal clients was a pilot named Charles Kinney, who had invested with him since the mid-90s and considered him, quote, like a family member.
I got to hold his baby, play with his kids. We knew his family.
Charles trusted Mark so much that around 2003 he brought his parents and two brothers into the financial planner's orbit. He later told CNN that he had left up to $2 million of his parents' money in Mark's care, who promised to invest it in various insurance products while avoiding specifics. What Mark didn't tell them was that he wasn't licensed to sell insurance products in Georgia. Not until a year after the sale, that is. Though occasionally the family had their suspicions, Mark was always able to relax such concerns by rattling off financial lingo that the average person wouldn't know was nonsense. At one point, Charles Kinney did his due diligence enough to inquire about surrender penalty fees incurred from moving money out of the investments, to which Mark said he had worked out a special deal with National Western that would waive them. This was, of course, a complete lie. For now, though, the Kinneys remained unawares. But the longer this stretched out, the bolder Mark became with his schemes. Around 2004, Mark befriended senior pilot David Smith, who entrusted his $1.3 million retirement fund to Heritage Wealth Management. He didn't know it yet, but Mark took that money and stuffed it in a 25-year-long annuity. Mark withdrew about 30% of the fund and moved the money around several times across several annuities, nabbing a 13% commission off each switch. Even as he was stabbing them in the back, though, Mark maintained his clients' trust through expensive presents, dinners at fancy restaurants, and even calling them on their birthdays. But once again, factors outside his control would soon imperil his racket. The ruse with National Western couldn't go on forever. A change in their policies cost Mark's clients much in dividends, and many demanded to pull out. This would threaten to reveal his habit of churning client investments, and the resulting penalty fees they still didn't know about. Adding to this, Mark was said to have sometimes used money right out of his clients' accounts whenever he came up short on his own bills, intending to replace the money before anybody noticed. Though he kept up with this in the beginning, it wasn't long before he found himself overwhelmed and needing to juggle money across his clients' accounts to keep up the appearance of balanced books. The Marcus Schrenker saga took an unexpected turn in May 2005, when he became the victim of a false arrest. As he was coming home from work one night, a police officer from Hamilton County pulled into his driveway and began accusing Mark of tearing through the neighborhood in a dirt bike similar to one that his son owned. Mark tried explaining the officer was mistaken, even allowing him to feel the bike's muffler to prove that it was cold. Though the officer was clearly wrong, his ego couldn't handle it, and he only grew more irritable after Mark asked him to get off his property. Instead, the cop demanded Mark show him his driver's license. Court documents indicate that when Mark turned to retrieve it from his car, the officer tackled him to the ground with no regard for the fact that he was holding his 3-year-old son at the time.
He grabbed me and handcuffed me, threw me to the ground right here, and basically just wrestled me as hard as he could.
Mark was put in cuffs and shuffled into the police cruiser, crying out in pain as the tackle had aggravated his back injury from years prior. A superior officer was soon on scene and motioned to release Mark, under the condition that he promised not to sue the police department for misconduct. Though Mark wasn't taken to county jail that night, he wasn't about to be muscled into letting the incident go without consequence. Mark took the matter to both the Sheriff's Department and the office of Hamilton County Prosecutor Sonia Learcamp. Rather than hear Mark out, though, the prosecutor told Mark she wasn't going to take action, and even threatened to press charges against Mark for filing what she called false accusations. An enraged Mark went ahead with filing the lawsuit, and after some consideration, the police department realized this was a losing battle and settled with the Schrenkers for about $50,000. Apparently, part of the settlement went towards a boob job for Michelle. Though Mark's latest brush with law enforcement left him vindicated, he didn't shy away from keeping up his dubious and quite illegal business practices. His firm was doing so well by this point that he had opened up a new branch in Atlanta, Georgia, home to a significant number of airline pilots. The Schrenker family soon followed, moving into one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city. Mark felt on top of the world. He was pulling in well over $1 million a year and now carried licenses to operate in Indiana, Georgia, Illinois, and Kentucky. The sky truly was the limit, and that limit was about to be taken even further with the impending bankruptcy of Delta Airlines. Mark had already won the trust of numerous Delta pilots ahead of the bankruptcy in 2005, managing retirement accounts for well over a dozen clients. Learning that a flailing Delta was looking to terminate its generous pension plan, Mark rallied some of his clients to fight the move as a group. He alleged that he had put together a case against Delta's claims that it was unable to fulfill its obligations towards the pensioners. But just days before he was set to testify, Mark withdrew. David Smith later said of him, quote, "He was very credible. He talked a good story. So we entrusted him with a task he never produced." It was David's belief that Mark grew anxious after a deposition hearing where a lawyer for Delta told the court about his 1990 arrest, along with the multiple securities lawsuits filed against him after 9/11. Continuing to fight Delta would only have put Mark further under the microscope, opening him up to more scrutiny that could unveil his ongoing schemes. Though it doesn't appear Mark was paid by the pilots he bailed on, they were nevertheless left blindsided. The sudden loss of Mark caused them to scramble, eventually costing them their pension plans and forcing them to settle for more modest terms. David later told the media they'd probably have fared better had Mark not gotten involved in the first place. Mark's habit of pulling money out of client accounts for his own expenses finally caught up with him, and it was none other than the Kinney family who blew the whistle. Mark had pulled over $120,000 out of their investments, telling them that the money would be transferred to their Fidelity account. Instead, he dumped the money into Heritage Wealth Management's coffers, with the intent to repay it when he had the chance. The Kinney family accountant received tax forms indicating the money had been withdrawn, but saw that it had never made it into their Fidelity account. Mark tried blustering his way out of the situation through email, and though he was initially successful, he failed to return the money even months later. The accountant finally called Mark out for this in early 2006, and he apparently blamed the missing cash on one of his employees. Mark finally repaid the money with interest in summer 2006, but by now the Kinneys no longer trusted him. The family suspected that if Mark tried pulling one fishy stunt with their money, he had probably done it before. And they were correct. They had the family accountant perform a complete audit of all their dealings with Heritage. This was how Mark's churning scheme was revealed, along with the substantial surrender penalties Mark had wrongly promised were no issue. David Kinney reamed Mark out over the phone for his treachery, revealing that he had contacted National Western and learned that Mark had lied about their special deal that would cover their surrender penalties. Without a moment's hesitation, he fired Mark, the man the Kinneys had trusted as a close family friend for almost a decade. The Kinney family tracked down everyone who they had recommended Mark to over the years and explained what he had done. Overnight, Mark lost a considerable amount of business, and there was no end in sight to the Kinney family's scorched earth tactics. Mark decided to try a different approach to get the Kinneys off his back. He told them over email that he had done some soul searching and came to the realization that he no longer liked money. He went on to say he had planned to shutter Heritage Wealth Financial, sell the family home, and give everything away to charity. As this was going on, Mark also tried regaining the business lost from an ex-client that wound up being a good friend of Michael Kinney. And that friend showed Michael an email promoting Heritage Wealth's money management strategy for 2007. The blatant lies Mark had fed the Kinneys only further enraged them. And so the family began assembling a collective of former Heritage clients, including David Smith, to take Mark down. Mark sent threatening letters after the Kinney parents blocked him from accessing their bank accounts, complaining that they were unjustly dragging his name through the mud. He ended off with a threat to sue the entire family. But it wasn't just the Kinneys he was fending off. At least 3 more parties joined the group of ex-clients, and backed up their complaints that Mark had moved around or outright stole money from right under their noses. Undaunted, the Kinneys led the charge by filing a complaint with the Georgia Insurance Commission office, providing investigators with evidence documenting Mark's scams. Charles Kinney sent a letter to National Western Life in May 2007. Charles went into detail about his decade doing business with Mark, laying out everything from the churning, to the lies about the surrender penalties, to the $120,000 that went missing. He also talked at length about how Mark invested his 70-year-old father's savings into a 15-year annuity that offered minimal dividends, hoping to make National Western truly understand the absurdity of dealing with Heritage. Charles concluded by asking that National Western release the Kinneys from all their annuities and for the return of the hundreds of thousands of dollars in assets tied up with them, along with a reversal of all surrender penalties caused by Mark. Complaints began piling up at the Georgia Insurance Commissioner's office. Before long, Mark was told that Heritage Wealth Management was to be audited on June 12, 2007. He complied, thinking that he could explain away everything he was being accused of, or at least feign ignorance well enough to avoid trouble. He was quite mistaken. According to his biography, one of the senior auditors saw right through his lies and threatened him with violating several Georgia insurance statutes. He was apparently given the option of voluntarily surrendering his license or having the findings of the audit sent over to the fraud unit. Knowing the jig was up, Mark gave up his license that same day. A week and a half later, the Schrenker family moved back to Indiana, where Mark could regroup and hopefully put everything behind him. Little did he realize, though, that this was only the beginning of his downfall. The tenacious Charles Kinney went ahead and informed state regulators in Florida, Indiana, and Kentucky through summer 2007. Not satisfied with simply running Mark out of Georgia, his newfound goal was to systematically disrupt his ability to commit further fraud anywhere he was said to be registered, and ultimately put him behind bars if possible. It was later discovered that Mark had not actually been licensed to sell insurance products to the Kinneys in Georgia when he did so in 2003. He didn't get registered in that state until May 2004. Mark was even brazen enough to write "issued in Louisville, Kentucky" on every contract the elder Kinneys signed. In his complaint to the Kentucky Office of Insurance, Charles affirmed that his parents had never even been to Louisville, catching Mark in yet another lie. Before long, the fraudster had another State Department breathing down his neck. Mark's back and forth with the Kentucky Department of Insurance in August 2007 was quite revealing. He claimed the complaint filed by the Kinneys contained several discrepancies and shifted the blame onto National Western. Mark accused the company of freezing client assets and delaying payouts as long as possible, going so far as to say he had resigned Heritage's appointment with National Western in 2006. Feigning sympathy, he went on to write, quote, "I believe in treating people right. I am remorseful and carry a heavy burden in regards to the Kinneys' experience with National Western Life. They are a great family, and I hurt for them." Yet he couldn't help himself from criticizing Charles taking on the lead for the group of ex-clients pursuing him, asking, quote, "How can a person make representations of fraud when he wasn't even at the meetings?" Most damning of all, Mark tried blaming Charles' father's supposed dementia for why there had been so much confusion about the details of the policies Mark had sold them. Fighting off claims that he had forged the father's signature, Mark said he hired a forensic handwriting specialist who concluded that the signature was genuine. He later told Matthew Cox that he wouldn't have known where to find such an expert, but said he did anyways because it sounded convincing. Mark's appointment as an agent with National Western Life was formally terminated on September 6, 2007 over, quote, "violation of the rules and regulations of the company and/or of the regulations of the state." His claims that he had resigned in 2006? Pure fiction. Mark's letter of resignation with National Western, which he had sent to the Kentucky Department of Insurance, was discovered to have been a backdated forgery. It seemed the only way Mark thought he could get away with his crimes was to commit even more crime, but officials in Kentucky were onto him. Hoping to quash any potential investigations, Mark sent a final letter to the Department of Insurance surrendering his Kentucky license. He even tried pulling the same ruse he did with the Kinneys, saying he was planning to leave the financial sector completely. By December, Mark learned that 3 of the financial companies he had worked with agreed to compensate his angry ex-clients. He figured this would be the end of his troubles with them, but of course, he couldn't be more wrong. Now it was the Indiana Department of Insurance coming after him. On December 19th, Mark was served with a list of charges from the state of Indiana. These included 8 counts stemming from complaints filed by the Kinneys, David Smith, and 5 other parties he had wronged. The Department of Insurance was pushing to have both Mark's personal license and the one held by Heritage Wealth permanently revoked, on top of thousands of dollars in fines for each violation. Mark got in touch with Indiana insurance investigator Lisa Harpineau to explain, claiming everything he was accused of was a series of misunderstandings. But it was too late for that. Lisa later told CNBC, quote, "His responses definitely raised the red flags with me. One of his responses said, 'I didn't know there were surrender fees associated with these annuities.' And I knew right there, either he's lying or he doesn't know how to sell an annuity, because any agent that sells annuities knows that there's going to be surrender fees involved." Mark's only choice was to try the same stunt that worked in Georgia and Kentucky, voluntarily surrendering his licenses. Throughout the 2007 Christmas season, Mark was slammed with complaints from both the insurance companies he had done business with and their assignees. Many were demanding back the commissions he had earned off his fraudulent practices. At the same time, Mark was fighting off a 2006 lawsuit from OM Financial, who had accused him of costing them business through slander to clients. Between this and the looming 2008 financial crisis, Mark's finances were at risk of being wiped out completely. Adding insult to injury, every state Mark was still licensed in were told about the ongoing investigation by the Indiana Department of Insurance. It was obvious that 2008 would be a very bad year to be Marcus Schrenker. Mark's desperation to make enough money to fight his growing legal battles gave him the perfect idea. He'd sell people on a new pitch he called the Fidelity International Eurofund. Put simply, the Eurofund was a foreign exchange fund Mark promoted that took advantage of the euro's relative strength compared to other world currencies which had weakened over the financial crisis. Except Fidelity didn't have any such investment. Instead, the money clients entrusted to Mark was deposited into his own bank accounts and used to pay for his business and personal expenses. Mark used a computer program to generate fake online accounts his clients could check that gave them the impression their Eurofund investments were growing. Throughout early 2008, he was able to swipe tens of thousands of dollars using the Eurofund. Mark was at the peak of his sleaziness throughout the summer of 2008. The Eurofund had more than made up for the burned bridges that had cost him so much business already. He continued fighting off lawsuits with increasingly manipulative tactics, falsely claiming during one deposition that he suffered from multiple sclerosis. But even while batting back this mountain of legal problems, Mark couldn't help himself from digging a deeper hole with yet more fraud. One of his most appalling crimes was stealing over $20,000 from his own aunt, after she gave him control of her investments in August 2008. He later told Matthew Cox, quote, "You've got to steal from your friends and family when your enemies won't do business with you." Despite never slowing down the fraud, Mark was definitely feeling the heat by late 2008. A former friend described him as a loose cannon who clashed with his neighbors more and more frequently during this time. Michelle admitted in an interview that Mark's temper was now all over the place, likely accelerated by his continued abuse of painkillers. She discovered that Mark was having an affair with a woman from the airport named Kelly Baker. It turned out that Mark was even bold enough to rent Kelly a condo around the corner from the Schrenker household, in the same building as the family's nanny. Michelle put pressure on Mark to end the affair, but despite his many promises, he kept seeing Kelly. Coupled with his constant lying finally catching up with him in the courts, it's unlikely Mark was feeling very festive come the 2008 holiday season. He owed the contractor who worked on his house close to $100,000 in unpaid invoices, eventually being forced to settle that November. At the same time, he was being pursued in court by someone he had sold a damaged aircraft to back in 2002. And though he didn't know it yet, the Indiana Department of Insurance had caught wind of Mark's non-existent Eurofund and were taking early steps to launch a full-blown investigation. His increasingly volatile personality was starting to be noticed by even his remaining clients. Making matters worse, a few days before Christmas, Mark was served with a $1.4 million lawsuit from National Western Life. The company was seeking to recoup his commissions after they were made to reimburse that disgruntled group of clients from years prior. The chickens were finally coming home to roost, and all Mark could do was continue pounding back OxyContins and booze in a feeble attempt to power through it. And in that haze of substance-fueled mania, Mark finally managed to kill what was left of his marriage. A few days after Christmas, Mark absconded with his mistress to Florida. This sent Michelle over the edge, and as he was living it up in the Sunshine State, she finally filed for divorce. But this would soon be the least of Mark's worries. His Indiana State Financial Advisor license expired on December 31st, and that same day the Schrenker family home was subject to a raid by authorities seeking evidence of securities violations while a bewildered Michelle watched. They took everything related to the Eurofund, which by now had cost Mark's victims hundreds of thousands of dollars. Mark was facing a long list of charges that could put him away for decades, and he didn't even know it yet. Michelle recounted his utter nonchalance about the ordeal upon his return.
He just kept saying, everything will be fine. It's a mistake. I'll take care of it.
But deep down, Mark knew nothing at all was fine, and he was already putting together a way to escape justice for his crimes. A few days after the raid, Mark got an unexpected call from his brother. His stepfather, Mike, had died, and he was expected at the funeral. Rather than use this as a time for reflection, Mark saw an opportunity to put together an exit plan before authorities could bring the hammer down on him. While the family was gathered at his mother's house, Mark managed to obtain his younger brother's driver's license and credit card as tools to assist in his great escape. The wheels were now in motion. Mark was now plotting a way to fake his own death. things weren't looking any better when he returned home. A federal judge in Maryland had just issued a $533,000 ruling against Heritage Wealth Management and OM Financial Life's favor. Mark was looking at paying out over $9 million across various judgments and legal claims. He knew that if he was going to fake his death, he'd have to do it before the authorities caught up with him. So on January 10th, he drove down to a storage locker outside Birmingham, Alabama with the red motorcycle that would later become his getaway vehicle, renting out the unit using his brother's ID and credit card. He then made his way back to Indiana to get his plane ready for takeoff a day later. It was a particularly frosty January 11th, with conditions so bad that airport staff warned Mark he was risking his life when he set off that evening. He was already feeling fairly reckless. Security cameras caught Mark doing donuts in the parking lot shortly before takeoff. Undaunted by the storm, Mark set his flight plan for Florida and began his ascent. While flying over Alabama, Mark radioed in to traffic control claiming he was experiencing severe turbulence. This was confusing though, since no other planes in the area had reported the same issues. When Mark was instructed to lower his altitude, he refused and kept going. A few minutes later, Mark radioed again to relay that his windshield had blasted open.
I'm bleeding profusely.
He then told them that he didn't expect to survive. Moments later, his radio went silent. Control scrambled to assist Mark, redirecting commercial traffic to avoid any in-air collisions. 2 jets were sent to intercept the wayward plane, and the Coast Guard was dispatched to keep an eye out for him. Upon locating the plane, however, the jet fighter pilots noticed things weren't adding up. The cockpit was dark, the door was open, and the windshield was completely intact. Little did they know Mark had already plunged himself into the Alabama darkness minutes earlier, having set the plane on autopilot with the intent of having it eventually crash into the Gulf of Mexico. It's thought Mark did this to make recovery of a body more difficult, and this might have worked had the plane not faltered somewhere over Florida, crashing in a swamp just yards away from a densely populated neighborhood. Experts said had the plane kept going a bit further, it would have crashed into the nearby homes. When authorities caught up to the wreckage, they found no sign of blood in the cockpit. Nor did they find Marcus Schrenker. What they did discover was an Atlas of America and the directory to an Alabama campground. No longer was this a search and rescue mission, it was now a full-blown manhunt for a fugitive on the run. Mark did, of course, survive his jump, and although he was injured, he managed to limp to a nearby house where he told the residents he had just been involved in a canoeing accident, which explained his wet clothing. Mark said he was planning to meet up with friends downstream. Encountering a police officer next, Mark told him the same story and asked for transportation to his storage unit in Harpersville, where his friends would be expecting him. The officer agreed, unaware that Mark was a wanted man. The officer later recalled that Mark had aviation goggles with him, a bit strange for someone who had supposedly just been out on the water. When Mark's made-up friends didn't arrive, he had the cops drop him off at a nearby motel where he rented out a room using cash. By the time the police had figured out what was happening, Mark had already abandoned the motel room and made his way into the woods nearby. Police were sent back to the storage unit to collect evidence, where they found little more than some discarded wet clothing in a nearby garbage can. Mark managed to elude investigators for now, but his face had already been plastered on television screens nationwide. Though his whereabouts were unknown at that time, Mark had fired off a rambling email to one of his friends back home, blaming himself for everything and asking to have the record set straight. He claimed to have suffered from hypoxia during his flight, which prompted his rash decision to abandon his aircraft. Mark didn't know it yet, but this email would soon become the smoking gun that led authorities straight to him. Mark rode down to a quiet KOA campground in Florida, where he booked a spot and set up camp. Laying low for the first night, Mark had no clear direction for moving forward and knew it was only a matter of time before the police found him. U.S. Marshals managed to trace the IP address from Mark's confessional email to the site by the night of the 13th, and when they arrived to arrest him, they found a tent smeared with blood on the outside. Inside the tent, police found Mark's laptop, a handheld GPS, the Florida and Alabama pages from a road atlas, and a 6-pack of Bud Light. Also discovered was a badly wounded Mark, mumbling incoherently due to a loss of blood from a deep gash in his wrist. One federal agent on the scene believed Mark wouldn't have survived another hour had they not found him. Mark's own account of the crash, as told to Matthew Cox, varied from what court documents and the media reported. It appears Mark had sensationalized some of the finer details for a more interesting story. His own memories include losing a testicle in the crash, a failed rendezvous with Kelly Baker, and being coerced by police into saying he was in a canoe accident under threat of being institutionalized. Of course, since Mark is the only one who can verify these points, it's best to take them with a grain of salt. At any rate, by the 14th of January, Mark was safely in custody and receiving treatment at a nearby hospital. Despite his dire condition, Mark was expected to make a full recovery. On top of his financial crimes, he was now facing felony charges including illegal destruction of an aircraft and making a false distress call, for which he was arrested after coming to. To make his day worse, Michelle used the surrounding media circus as a chance to go public with her accusations of cheating. But even after being caught literally red-handed, Mark still had a few lies left in him. After his escapade ended, Mark called his stepmother and told her his arm was cut off in the plane crash. It would be a long road ahead, but amazingly, Mark had no intention of going down without a fight. Mark was facing up to 2 decades in prison and millions in settlement costs. Bail was set at $4 million to avoid another flee attempt. Michelle denied any foreknowledge of her husband's crimes to the media, saying her decision to file for divorce was driven purely by his unfaithfulness. Former friends and neighbors told the media about Mark's vindictive streak, with few expressing surprise at what he had done.
You heard from his neighbors and people lived across the street about what was going on, and it was just hard to believe it didn't sync up with the guy that I knew. You know, there's a lot of stories, and they're urban legends, but you know, to hear so many of them, you have to believe at least one of them is true. And if any one of them are true, you just think this guy's crazy.
One of the disgruntled clients who helped bring him down years earlier also came forward, saying that Mark had threatened to kill him unless he dropped a pending lawsuit. Meanwhile, the Indiana Department of Insurance plowed ahead with their own investigation and charged Mark with conducting business transactions throughout early January after his license had expired. Mark was formally indicted by a federal grand jury on January 21st. Since his bank account had been frozen, Mark was assigned a public defender. Initially, Mark pled not guilty to the federal charges, with his lawyer arguing he wasn't mentally fit for trial. He was apparently calling up whatever news outlets were willing to talk to him, telling them he had no memory of the plane crash. Mark was thus ordered by the judge to undergo a psychiatric evaluation. He was certified fit for trial. Now out of options, Mark had no choice but to finally face the music. During his many media appearances and court hearings, he would attempt to explain away what happened with flimsy excuses, but was often rebuked by contradicting evidence in court. He tried using the hypoxia explanation for why he jumped, only to be told that hypoxia cannot occur at the altitude he had been flying at. Mark also told the courts he had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder back in 1991, and though this was entirely plausible, the diagnosis had never once shown up on any of his airmen's medical examinations up to January 2007. One memo from the court pointed out that if Mark was indeed bipolar, it's unlikely that he would have been allowed to keep his FAA license. Given no other option, Mark quickly fessed up to the botched plan to fake his own death. After pleading guilty to the federal charges, Mark was sentenced to a little over 4 years in prison plus restitution. Next, he had to face the much bigger hurdle of his state charges in Indiana. But luckily for Mark, the prolific nature of his case meant that lawyers were falling over backwards to represent him pro bono, as a means of gaining notoriety. He chose an attorney named P. Chadwick Hill, who promised to do everything in his power to get him the best deal possible. And boy, did Chad deliver. All in all, Mark was given 20 years, but between suspended sentencing, good behavior, and time already spent, he would only need to serve another 5 years in the slammer. Michelle Schrenker spent her share of time in the spotlight answering for her estranged husband's crimes, appearing on Dateline and other shows to offer her side of the story. Questions were raised over her own culpability since she was technically the CFO of Mark's companies, but Michelle continued to insist that she was completely out of the loop when it came to Mark's crimes. Though he did try throwing her under the bus in an interview with a local TV station, Hamilton County prosecutors decided against pressing charges on Michelle. But even if she avoided legal trouble, there was still the matter of Mark making restitution to his victims. The family's assets were liquidated and sold off at police auctions, among them the planes, the getaway motorcycle, and of course the house. Michelle would quickly have to go to work to keep dinner on the table for herself and the kids. Needless to say, the Schrenker divorce went ahead without so much as a second thought. Mark was shuffled around various prisons before landing at FCC Coleman in Florida. He had been telling media outlets since at least 2009 that he was planning a tell-all memoir based on his own idea of what happened. Apparently, Mark would regale his fellow inmates with stories about his experiences in Operation Desert Storm, even though he would have been absurdly young at the time. In 2013, he met a fellow white-collar criminal named Matthew Cox, who was known amongst the inmates as an accomplished storyteller and budding author. Mark convinced Matthew to begin writing a biography of his life that he hoped would paint him in a better light. Throughout the writing of Bailout, Matthew recalls having to call Mark out on his constant untruths by presenting him with contradicting court documents or media pieces. Eventually, Matthew told Mark there was only so much he could do to make Mark seem more sympathetic, which apparently he wasn't thrilled to hear. The fraudster tried to renege on the deal and get the book pulled from shelves. Mark then began bombarding Matthew with angry emails and even filed a DMCA complaint over excerpts Matthew published on his website, going so far as to say the interviews were completely made up. But despite Mark's best efforts, as of December 2023, Bailout is still available through various retailers. Mark wasn't without advocates in prison, and these would be crucial to his goal for early release. Letters from church chaplains and other allies described him as turning his life around, and these appeals for modifying his sentencing appear to have been successful. Marcus Schrenker left the penal system in 2015 and was placed on parole for 4 years. He seems to have kept a low profile since release, and what steps he's taken to turn his life around remain unknown. Overall, the Marcus Schrenker saga can be characterized by a tremendous feeling of total waste. There was no need for him to lie about working for NASA or to come up with any of his harebrained schemes to cheat people out of their hard-earned money. After all, this was a man poised to do well no matter what, given his unique talents. Ultimately, Mark's downfall is a cautionary tale about the danger of indulging in one's worst traits, and how that, combined with the senseless urge to prove something, can cost a man everything. A special thank you is in order to Matthew B. Cox, who has graciously allowed passages of his book to be used for this video and was a tremendous help in clarifying certain details. Bailout, along with Matthew's other books, are thrilling reads and should not be overlooked, and can be found on his website InsideTrueCrime.com.